There are many perspectives on sex work, but it is without a doubt that those who make money from prostitution, pornography, and other forms face stigma. This is an issue which divided the feminist movement. Is sex work an empowering profession or a form of exploitation? Here tonight we've got 4 paper speakers to discuss this motion. Tonight's debate format is a bit different to usual, and there's, I'll be honest, 2 reasons for that. The first is we faced some last-minute dropouts and had to sort of rethink the format. The second is me and Sam wanted to try something different for a debate this term and thought it was the perfect candidate. So you're probably used to 3 paper speakers speaking tonight, and the format being sort of going through the motions, predominantly paper speakers. We want a much more interactive debate this evening, and that means that we've only got 2 rounds of paper speeches, and then we're going to move to rights of reply. And this will give all our speakers a chance to directly reply to you, the floor speakers. So that's the change. With that being said, I'll run you through what debate format will look like. We'll open with our proposition speaker. She will speak first. We'll then go across the floor to opposition and then to you, the members, for floor speeches. We'll go to our second round. We'll go to our second proposition speaker, second opposition, and then back to you, the members. Then we'll have right to reply. Please, please make a floor speech tonight. It's so good to hear them. They improve the debate so much. If you've got anything to say, you don't have to be an expert, put your hand up and get involved. If you don't fancy a floor speech, you can also do a point of information. That means at any point in a speaker's 10-minute speech, you can put your hand up and say, on that point, a point of information, and they can, you can say what you think, and they can choose to accept or deny it. So I hope this is a really interactive debate. There's no point having 500 of you here if we don't have something interactive. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it'll be a wonderful debate. With that said, I'm going to welcome the first speaker for the proposition, and that's Caroline Spiegel. Caroline is the founder and CEO of Quinn, the app for audio erotica. Before dropping out to start Quinn, Caroline studied computer systems at Stanford and worked at Protocol Labs. Quinn is on a mission to elevate the romance genre and introduce immersive, ethical, erotic content into the mainstream. Caroline, you have the ears of the house.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all tonight. It's so great to just see so many young, involved people ready to have a good conversation and hopefully disagree a little bit and really dig into this. So like you mentioned, Laura, my name is Caroline Spiegel. I run a tech startup. It's called Quinn, and it's an app for audio erotica. I guess I want to start my piece here by reading a quote from psychotherapist and author Esther Perel. Sex isn't just something we do. Sex is a place we go. In every culture and in every era, sex is the window through which you can look at the most archaic, rooted, deep values of a society. Its treatment of women, its treatment of children, its relationship to privilege, power dynamics, and to double standards. However, sex is also the window through which the most radical, progressive changes take place. So I basically just want to argue that sex is a medium, like music or painting, through which many different messages can be transmitted and expressed. In other words, sex work is compatible with feminism when it is feminist. So, to illustrate this, I want to talk about 2 very different forms of sex work and sex content online. It may sound like I'm talking from the other side of the podium at points, but that's part of the whole thing of it. So, okay. Number 1, my first example is Pornhub. We've all been there in incognito mode. At the time I'm writing this, blonde teen destroyed on the couch, rough hard, is the second video in the most viewed videos in the United States section on Pornhub. This video actually stars a sexual predator named James Dean, who's accused of the rape of over 10 women. And to quote one accusation, James Dean held me down and fucked me while I said no, stop, and used my safe word. I just can't nod and smile when people bring him up anymore. Also featured in the most popular section on Pornhub is an account called Face Fucking. This is actually the profile for a premium website for facial abuse, which is the act of sexually humiliating your partner by abusing and degrading her face during rough oral sex and holding her head on your genitalia. So, and by the way, they call the account Face Fucking, but it's actually it links to facial abuse, but the word abuse would trigger the Pornhub moderation algorithm. They've found some super clever ways to get around it. The account has over 22 million views, and one of its most popular videos is actually titled Anti-Facial Abuse Feminist Face Fucking Session Goes Wild. So Wow, that's a lot. But that's the most, popular mainstream porn site in the world. Now, I want to totally shift and talk about Quinn and our content. And this is not sponsored. Our iOS app has been around for about a year now, and it has been downloaded millions of times, and it makes millions of dollars every year. One of our trending audios this week is called Morning Feels, and it's voiced by a voice actor that goes by Anani Fun. The tags on the audio are boyfriend experience, oral, praise, and dirty talk. Some of the comments read, "Thank you. Due to some bad stuff in my life, I can't handle being physical. You allowed me to feel intimacy I haven't felt in a long time. Really, thank you." Another one reads, "Wait a freaking minute. This guy is sexy as fuck. He talks the perfect dirty talk. He whispers he's fun in bed, and he makes coffee and did the dishes." And And in case you think this type of content is only enjoyed by women, here's a comment from a male listener on a female voice actor's audio. "Holy shit, this was the hardest I've come in a long time." Why stop now, right? And he says, "OMG, thank you." So that's to illustrate to you that sex work is not all the same, just as sex is not all the same. Ask anyone who's ever had sex. Sex work in some contexts can be empowering and freeing, and in others can be degrading, terrifying, and dehumanizing. As a quick detour, I want to note that by empowering sex, I don't mean vanilla sex. Quinn does not only have vanilla, loving, boyfriend experience sex. We have audios with bondage, intense role play, dom-sub relationships, and the like. Kink, taboo, and play are an important part of good sex. However, tube site pornography uses kink as a guise. Any audio on Quinn that involves roleplay or kink has informative tags, framing of the scenario, and clear consent and communication. On Quinn, I don't know is there a time situation? I see it now. Okay. On Quinn, voice actors tell extremely erotic stories designed to make the listener orgasm. It is a sexual performance and fantasy, and voice actors perform alone from the comfort of their own home. On sites like Pornhub and YouPorn, however, 80% of content features violence against women, real violence that actually happened in real life. Lines are blurred between fantasy and reality, and physical qualities like being small or young-looking, being Asian, Black, or Latina are exploited and fetishized. Again, you might think I'm talking about another side, but I'm not. Pornography featuring non-consensual, abusive, or dehumanizing sex expands the reach and influence of these acts, normalizing them and reinforcing power imbalances in our society. But this is the important part. By the same token, pornography featuring ethical, empowering sex work disrupts the power imbalances in our society and expands the reach and influence of feminism. I do not agree with undiscriminating, superficial sex positivity. Feminists who believe that our sex lives and kinks should be free from criticism, never to be questioned or interrogated. I don't agree with that. The machinations of sex work, and pornography are political, and like Esther Perel said, reflect the values of our society. I believe that sex work and porn, like other mediums of expression, can be degrading to the feminist cause and also further the feminist cause. I know empowering sex work exists because I run a platform for it, and I also believe it is the future of erotic content online. So thank you all. That's it. I know it's a little short.
Thank you, Caroline, for such a fine speech. I'm sure you've gained more than a few subscribers tonight. Moving across the floor, I'd like to now welcome Ellie Breeze. Ellie is a second-year undergraduate student reading HSBS at Peterhouse and the Michaelmas Equalities Officer for the Union. She won the right to speak for open audition. Ellie, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you, Madam President. Just to sort of echo what Lara was saying earlier, I cannot explain, one, how nervous and terrified, but mainly how happy and so glad and grateful to see so many people here tonight to have this conversation, and not just women in the chamber as well, seeing a range of individuals. men and women, it really demonstrates that there is an appetite for this conversation, not just within the society, but within the university more broadly. And I could not be more proud to say that we are having this conversation in this chamber, and thank you all genuinely for attending. Unless you disagree with me, then you can leave if you don't mind. But I just want to start with sort of almost a couple of disclaimers, so to say. When I first told my friends that I was going to be speaking in opposition to this motion, they said to me, please, God, don't tell me you're going to make some conservative argument about purity and how women need to be pure to have a valid argument, anything like that. And I was like, girl, no, don't you worry about that. This argument is not meant, first and foremost, to demean individuals that engage in sex work. It is not to say that I do not respect individuals that participate in sex work. I do believe people can rationally and willingly choose to engage in sex work, and this also is not just an issue faced by women. I want to also highlight men can engage in sex work. Men can be sex workers themselves. So I need you all to pull me up, actually. If I ever say specifically women or female-specific pronouns, please do call me up. I'm trying to be gender neutral in this debate. But the point here that I'm trying to make, and the reason why I'm stood on this side, is because I genuinely believe that any engagement with an oppressive system, more specifically with the tools of that oppression, not aimed at destroying those tools of oppression, not aimed specifically at the liberation of individuals from that system, cannot, under any circumstances, be compatible with a liberation movement such as feminism. To illustrate this argument, I'll talk briefly about capitalism and Marxism, and to use that as an example of a liberation movement, but also to highlight the fact that I don't think it's hypocritical for individuals who claim to be feminists to engage in sex work. That's an important distinction that I want to make here. I do believe you can be feminist and engage in something that contributes to the oppression of women that supposedly stands in dichotomy to the movement that you claim to represent. Indeed, the notion that fucking has become freedom, and I credit Alex for this quote that she told me about 2 hours ago, that is entirely misconstrued and indeed has falsely defined liberation in the male interest. This is a claim that I will elaborate on later. But first, I want to critically assess the claim that sex work exists as a form of liberation by introducing a conversation about the public and the private and a distinction between that. Going back in history, unfortunately not that long ago actually, women existed as a form of private property. We were owned by our husbands, we were owned by our fathers. We could not hold property, we could not hold money, we could not hold land. We were owned, we were there to be sold and bought. We were there to be traded. Feminist movements from around sort of the 50s, 60s onwards sought to abolish that link. They sought to directly establish women as individuals in their own rights, not in relation to their male counterparts or male relatives. But along the way, and I fear the patriarchy may have had something to do with this, women have shifted from private property to public property. And more specifically, women's sex lives have become public property in the public domain. And that's what I want to critique, and that is my issue with sex work. Women's right to privacy has seemingly been revoked. Our sex lives are now in the public sphere. They are free game, so to say, to speculate on, to comment on, and to judge. Now, sex entering the public sphere isn't necessarily bad. That is something that I want to specify. Rather, it's the property aspect of that, and the fact that men, overwhelmingly men, feel justified and legitimized when it comes to commenting on women's sex lives and what they choose to do behind closed doors. The issue with sex, and more specifically sex work existing in the public sphere, is in a sense it legitimizes this old narrative of women as sexual beings. It implies that women want sex inherently. As the quote that I said earlier, fucking being freedom, really illustrates this. Because I think something that we forget is that the feminist movement is not entirely homogenous. It's incredibly diverse. And women within that movement, and indeed men within that movement, don't necessarily want to have sex. They don't necessarily want to engage in sexual behavior. You have the ace community, you have the aromantic community more broadly within the LGBTQ+. But By equating liberation with sex, by equating liberation more specifically with sex work, it feels as though we're disregarding that aspect of the feminist movement. It feels like we're disregarding that aspect of the population, disregarding what they want and conversations that they could have and they could offer. So the first claim that I wanted to challenge here tonight was this supposed supremacy of sexual liberation and how it's been co-opted to assume women's sexuality and assume women want to engage in sex. As I stated earlier, sex work is not inherently feminist, but as I said, feminists can engage in it. The second thing that I wanted to highlight was more broadly the tools of the patriarchy. And I wanted to elaborate on my claim earlier, claiming that the feminist movement had, in a sense, been co-opted by male interests and liberation had been redefined in the male interest, more specifically regarding sex. This idea of liberation, specifically talking about the second wave of feminism when it comes to the 1960s and the 1970s, and this idea of sexual liberation predominantly characterized in the form of sex work, has created this image of this sexually free, and I'm saying that in quotation marks if anyone can't see at the top, free woman who sleeps around, she's free, she's good fun, she likes to party, she goes out every night, comes back with another guy every other night. And that behavior and that lifestyle is obviously completely fine for an individual to engage in. But what I challenge is the characterization and the assumption that every single woman under the patriarchy, every single woman engaged in the feminist movement believes that and acts like that. Some women want to wait for marriage. Some women don't want to wait at all. And both options are completely valid. But the equation of liberation to sex challenges and blurs that divide and erases an entirely valid community within the feminist movement.
Point of information.
Yes.
Before you're conflating sex work is a necessary part of liberation as opposed to something within the subset of liberation.
Could you say that one more time? I'm really sorry.
So you're sort of saying that individual women or indeed men have their own choices with the movement, and I completely agree. But does that not put you on that side of the bench? Because that means it can be compatible. The motion is suggesting that it's a necessary part of feminism or indeed liberation.
Yes, no, and I would completely agree with you there. I think what I was trying to do in this speech is highlight the importance of choice, but the issue that I take when it comes to equating sex work as a form of feminism is that, as I'm going to go on to sort of highlight properly later, sex work engages with the tools of the patriarchy and, in a sense, it legitimizes those tools of the patriarchy. It legitimizes a certain viewing of women under the patriarchy. And so what I'm claiming is that while sex work indeed is a valid choice for individuals to engage in, it is not necessarily something that contributes to getting rid of the patriarchy, in a sense. And that is the issue that I take when we're trying to make the claim that it's feminist. So I hope that answers your question. Nice. Moving on, as I was going to regarding the tools of oppression within the patriarchy. And something that I wanted to speak quite candidly about, actually, in this chamber, was that the patriarchy, and when we have conversations surrounding the patriarchy, we tend to treat it as this far-off theoretical conversation. And indeed, I think this is something, when it comes to conversations in Cambridge more generally, we tend to forget that these are real issues, and this is a real conversation that impacts people's lives. When it comes to experiences as a woman, and more specifically experiences as a female student at this university, I know, sadly, that next to every single woman in this chamber will relate to the experiences that I'm about to relay. And that is a heartbreaking fact that it's something I struggle to reconcile every single day when it comes to living this reality under the patriarchy. Texting your friends before you go out, before you go for a walk, texting your friends when you're at the club, your friends running up to check on you when you go off with someone to make sure that they haven't somehow kidnapped you, checking for drink spikes, you can never leave your drink alone, leave it unattended, you can't be left unalone, you can't be left unattended. It's those experiences that I wanted to try and communicate here tonight to highlight that whilst, yes, this is a theoretical conversation that we're having in the safety of this chamber, the fact is Safety is not a guarantee for individuals, and more specifically women, under the patriarchy, and that's why I feel so strongly about this debate. To try and conclude briefly, sex work engages with the tools of the patriarchy and in tools of oppression. It presents women as objects. It presents women as things to be used and things to be thrown away and discarded when no longer wanted. It places women, more specifically women's sex lives, firmly into the public sphere, but not as a form of liberation, as a form of property, of public intellectual property for speculation, for laughs, for jokes. Sex work is not feminist. That does not mean to say it is not valid, and individuals who engage with it are not valid, but any action undertaken under this system of patriarchy, not specifically aimed at the liberation of individuals from that system, cannot be misconstrued as a form of liberation. And indeed, if we want to see progress, if we want to see change, we need to recognise that reality. And we need to take action, start dismantling this system, so that women, and indeed all individuals under it, can walk around and feel safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie, for such a moving speech. And thank you as a court officer for this term for encouraging us to have these conversations, because they really are so important. Order, you can speak in just a moment and a floor speech. So there really is a moment. Okay, perfect. We're now moving to my favourite part of the night, and that's to you, the members, for floor speeches. If you've got something to say, please put your hand up. We'll get you a mic, give you your name and college, and a 1 to 2 minute reason for why you're voting in your way. Taking first speeches in proposition.
I would have absolutely given way to a female speaker on what is a woman's topic, but I take the spirit of what Ellie said, that the feminist movement is wide, and maybe men can be feminists too. So I'm something to say. So far, we've talked about feminism as a series of ideals to strive for, mainly about gender equality. But feminism is also a movement, and it's a movement that's existed for a decent bit of history now. And to say it's just about those ideals is kind of similar to saying conservatism is just about freedom or liberalism is just about progress. It's not wrong, but it's a little bit reductive. So I want to give an example in history of when sex workers have really advanced the feminist cause, right? An example I'm going to pick is the Midwest in sort of 1800s Wild West America, right? Here's a place where you had loads of sex workers providing a huge amount of income to the local economies and gaining an awful lot of power. And they were using that income to found schools in form of, Madam, can I take you a sec? 'Cause I think I'm around the point. To found schools, and interestingly, they had so much political capital that Wyoming, in the heart of the Midwest, was founded as the first state to give women the right to vote. Now, if there's a real metric for progress of the feminist movement, getting women the right to vote is a pretty famous one. And the fact that that happened in the only state where sex workers had a lot of power is pretty significant. I think we should probably recognize that when we have these benefits, you can have in two sorts at the same time. And I think this might preempt your POI. In fact, I'll let your POI come now. Yeah, so two things can be true at the same time, right? It can totally be true that in the modern world where women have, thank God, avenues besides sex to show value for society, we should not be championing sex work as a first choice for all women, right? That can also be true, right? But what can also be true is that in the darker periods of history where, yes, these people were miserable, sex work was a mechanism by which they gained political power and got the vote and actually made some progress for the feminist cause, right? So we can believe those two things at once. That the ideal of sex work, principle, might not be quite true, even when still recognize the value that sex workers have given to the feminist movement historically.
Across to abstentions. Just there.
Okay, well, I'm not actually really abstaining. I just have a question that I wanted the last two speakers to say. This debate has been very interesting, but it feels to me just very heteronormative. And I wondered if, both sides of the argument could talk about, sex work from women for women, sex work from men for men, sex work from men for women. How does that fit into being incompatible with feminism or compatible?
The end. Across to the opposition, just at the front in the red dress.
Alex Horan, Churchill College. And I wanted to respond to that actually, in that I completely get what you mean, in that we're talking a lot about male violence and men against women. But I think what I'm about to say might kind of tackle that, and that I really dislike the notion that feminism is about empowerment, because I think that the parameters of power have been really historically defined under male terms. And I like Ellie's definition that feminism is about liberation. And to me, it's liberation from a patriarchal and capitalistic system. And to me, I can't see how we claim that the commodification of primarily the female body is liberation. How can we claim that when consent can be bought? How can we liberate ourselves from sexual violence when our consent can be bought? I physically cannot reconcile it in my brain, and I take great insult that the face of sex work has become this middle-class white woman in her apartment selling underwear pictures who will never face a real-life consequence for that, when the actual face of sex work, the majority of sex workers on this planet are the street sex workers, who are 82% of them report facing physical assault and 75% of them report facing sexual violence. That's just reported. I have no qualms in speculating that's closer to 100%. And there will always be inherent danger in a system where your body, not your labor, your body is your commodity, and that system cannot be compatible with feminism. Like, Joe, I completely get what you're saying, in that women gaining capital can be really seen as feminist, but also, once you get to a certain point and you're gaining capital, you're oppressing other people. And I don't see how what is empowering for you is empowering for the rest of the female, anyone, just under a capitalist system. So that's why the male feminist thing comes into it. But I just think that there's this era of girl boss feminism, and if it's your choice, and I just think choices don't exist in a vacuum, and think critically about why we are making this choice. The sex industry, historically, and still to this day, preys on the most vulnerable women who are desperate. And it's horrible, and I think, basically, it's just, we can't claim it's being empowering when it doesn't empower everyone. Just because it empowers you doesn't mean it empowers everyone.
Thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate the intervention. Because we have a liberty of time on our side, I'm going to do another round of floor speeches here. So moving back to our proposition. Up in the rafters, we are never going to get a mic to there, so you're able to project. That would be wonderful.
I chose to wear eyeliner today, and I acknowledge that this is not necessarily a feminist action to do. But you can't deem somebody and their actions incompatible with feminism, because it's a complicated world, and as much as I hate to say it, there are rules that we have to follow or else face social rejection. Maybe if I were a better feminist, I would do everything in my power to reject the patriarchy. Maybe if I were a better Marxist, I would give up all of my personal property. Another way to look at it is that feminists' lives, it's true, should not be dictated by the patriarchy. I shouldn't do all these things. But equally, I shouldn't be told what I can't do by the patriarchy.
think it's when it comes. Oh gosh, sorry. I think something important to acknowledge is that feminists do not have to live perfectly feminist lives to be feminist, to support the feminist movement. In the same sense, Marxists don't have to be perfectly Marxist, give up all their private property to be considered a Marxist. When it comes to actions like, I've got makeup on today, I completely agree with you that action perhaps wasn't necessarily the most feminist of me, but that doesn't negate the fact that I recognise what is and is not compatible with feminism. So would you not acknowledge that there can be complexities in this argument? We can acknowledge one action is not compatible with feminism while still being feminist and still engaging in certain behaviours.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I feel that my argument is kind of similar to yours, but I take it from a proposition point of view, because I think that the wording of the question is compatible. Somebody cannot be incompatible with feminism, or a sex worker is not incompatible with feminism. If somebody tried to tell me that I am incompatible with feminism because I'm wearing eyeliner, yes?
I completely agree with you, but I don't think we're talking about individuals, we're talking about structures and the sex work industry, rather than individual sex workers. So I completely agree with you.
I mean, I think the question is worded in a way in which it can be interpreted in several different ways, but one thing I have to say, which is kind of slightly different, is deeming choices incompatible with feminism is exclusionary, and this contradicts the mission of feminism, which is to encourage as many people as possible to improve your cause, to fight for equality of all genders. And I've had several debates which go along the lines of, can you be a man and a feminist? Can you be a Tory and a feminist? And these are interesting things to discuss, and I loved taking part, but if there was a man or a Tory in that room and they come and hear these people saying they shouldn't be included in the movement, it's going to make them reject it, and that goes against our purposes as feminists. And it just is not constructive. So I think that it is not incompatible with feminism to be a sex worker or to support sex work.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'll now move to abstention.
I think when we look at is sex work feminist or not, we're kind of detracting, because if we're arguing is it feminist or not, we're taken away from a very nuanced conversation. And even when we're describing sex work, what do we mean? Because there are many different types of sex work. There's digital sex work, there's physical sex work. One is more dangerous than the other, so we can't really compare it. So I think by making it into a binary argument, we can either lead to the girl bossification of sex work, whereas arguing the other side too much can lead to a lot of sex work exclusionary radical feminism. So I think we need to stop looking at it as it's feminist, it's not feminist, and we need to just open up the discussion to a more wider conversation.
Thank you for that. And finally, to our opposition.
Does a man's right to nut come before the safety of women? I don't think it does. And I know everybody and a lot of people are included in sex work, but it disproportionately impacts women. Women are, when we're talking about sex work, like Alex said, we're not talking about the OnlyFans model in the comfort of her living room. We're talking about women on the streets of Liverpool selling their body for food. And I think it's a cozy way of looking at it. There's no problem with being exclusionary about it, because we have to fight for principles. And if those principles mean that it's wrong to purchase sexual consent, if a man wanted to sleep with me, I say no, but then he offers me money for it and I'm poor, is that okay? Is that acceptable? I think we all know that these topics are not as clear-cut as we think, and I think it disproportionately does impact minorities, women, vulnerable groups. And men's desires, for the most part, have been catered to throughout history. How have we as a society given women education rights, fought for all these things, and now we have women who are counting down the clock to turn 18 so they can set up a camgirl site? I think that's going against
the advancement of women's rights, and that's my case for it.
Yeah, of course.
I just wanted to clarify that the opposition is saying sex work can be, and the opposition is saying sex work cannot be. And so it's like, we just have to prove that there is one way for sex work to be feminist rather than all sex work being feminist, which I think is an important distinction.
Thank you so much. I'll move now back to our paper speeches and to Judera Egore. Judera is popularly known as the Slumflower. She's an author and advocate who rose to popularity from her viral movement, Saggy Boobs Matter, in 2018. Since then, she's become a #1 Sunday Times best-selling author with her first book, What a Time to Be Alone, and has brought an important conversation about women's bodies and autonomy to the forefront through her 2020 Channel 4 documentary, Bring Back the Bush. Judera, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you to everyone for being here. When I got invited to be a part of this debate, I felt incredibly honored, excited, and raring to be involved because I think this conversation is so important, but I will admit it's not an easy conversation to be a part of because feminism is still evolving and it's not perfect. I'm sure we're all familiar with the argument or statement that not everything a woman does is feminist just because she's a woman. And when we discuss, can sex work and feminism be compatible, I wonder if we can also ask, can capitalism and feminism be compatible? Because for a lot of people, especially the women who are forced by their circumstances under capitalism to partake in sex work that involves them physically engaging with men, it's not always seen as empowering for them. And unfortunately, I wish that in our society, we would give more room to have conversations about when women do involve themselves in physical, in-person sex work with men, how they're protected and what they have to deal with, because we do exist in a society where, for the most part, men feel entitled to women's bodies. However, as someone myself, speaking from the perspective of a person who has experienced a lot of pushback on the internet for expressing sentiments that basically say that I wouldn't date a man who can't take care of me, that has gotten me into a lot of debates on the internet and a lot of people disagreeing because it pushes the idea that, love isn't genuine if money is involved. And in the same way, it kind of leads to the argument a lot of people have that sex work doesn't create room for genuine, intimate connections, and that's something that I strongly argue against, especially because probably from 2019, I would say, I dabbled in and out of experimenting with being a dominatrix, and it really opened my eyes to a lot of things, especially when it comes to power dynamics between men and women. And for a lot of people, dominatrixing, if that's a phrase, is a profession that they get paid for. And for those who aren't aware, being a dominatrix basically means that you are selling a service where you dominate men and you carry out a fantasy where you make them do things that they want to be made to do. So for some women, that involves findom, which is known as financial domination, where some women are handed the power to take over a man's finances. But what's interesting is within that, I've come across a lot of arguments from people saying that, well, if you're a financial dominatrix, then have you ever considered that the men you might be engaging with might be mentally ill? And have you ever thought you might be taking advantage of them? Because why are they so willing to hand you access to their money? And I find that argument quite fascinating because the idea that a man would be so enthusiastic to part ways with his money to express his attraction to a woman must mean he's mentally ill. And I think it tells you a lot about our society when we, associate men who are willing to share their resources with mental illness. But what's also fascinating about that counter-argument is that in a world where women are unfortunately subjected to a wage gap, being able to advocate for yourself financially is a very powerful thing. And what I find fascinating is that we don't realize when we're demonizing women for things that men are asking for, because if there wasn't a demand for it, then the service wouldn't be there. And off the back of that discussion as well, when it comes to financial domination, when people say things like, oh, that woman is taking advantage of that poor mentally ill man who has lots of disposable income to share with her, why do we not have that same argument towards bartenders that serve alcoholics alcohol? And why I say that is because the idea that a man must be being taken advantage of for actively seeking a service, again, flips the onus onto the woman and demonizes the woman for knowing how to harness her power in a society where men largely feel entitled to sex. And so for me, going back to what I initially said about receiving pushback on the internet for saying that I would only date a man who has the financial means to bring ease to my life, the reason why a lot of people have felt strongly opposed to that is because it's the idea that I'm putting a paywall between myself and a man. And a lot of us have internalized this idea that love is only real if it involves struggling. And I think for me, the more I express those sentiments about wanting to be taken care of and the more I receive pushback, it has really opened my eyes to the fact that we aren't really as educated as we believe we are about what it means for a woman to respond to a patriarchy with her own version of feminism. For some women, their version of feminism is being a dominatrix as a black woman and making white men write essays about why black women deserve reparations. And while some people might argue that it's laborious on the woman's part to ask him to write that essay, I just want to argue that it's absolutely hilarious when he actually does write the essay. But also, it's about being able to engage with men on terms that allow you to fulfill your own power. Because for a lot of people, there is still that fear of men. Even in vanilla relationships, we don't want to admit it, but we fear men. We fear letting them down, we fear disappointing them, we fear telling them no. But for me, a lot of my feminism on my own journey as a woman, and for many women who occupy a similar interest and position as me, our feminism has involved actually saying, no, I don't want to do that with you, or saying, if you do want to do that with me, here's what I would like. And being able to express that power and actually seeing results from it is a very... I'm listening. Not necessarily. I would say that in a patriarchal society where women are overpowered by men, I feel like whilst you can't personally empower your way out of a physical structure that is patriarchy, I do believe that being able to exude your own boundaries, whatever those are, is a way of being able to live what it means to feel your own power. But for every woman, that will look different. So for some women, it might be that they want to practice a lifestyle of dominating men on their own terms. For some women, it might be that they'll sell foot pictures. But what's fascinating about the sex work conversation is that within the world we live in, we still find ways to distance ourselves from sex work. So I personally believe that selling foot pictures, even if it's not you using any kind of sexual language, it is still participating in sex work. But the reason why we want to distance ourselves from sex work is because we still internalize that shame that, sex work is bad and sex work must mean that you're this twisted person, where actually I think that as much as sex work carries its dangers, under capitalism, unfortunately, all labor technically is forced. So whilst there will be some people that choose to take part in jobs because they can and they want to, there will be some people who take part in jobs because they have to. And as long as we're not seeing a world where we're advocating for those who are participating in sex work because they have to, and we're not creating a world where those people are made to feel safe, and we're not hammering down on men, Because the problem is, again, those women who are participating in sex work, as in physical, in-person sex work, are being faced with the most violence from men, whereas those who are participating in sex work, maybe on the internet, might experience being doxxed, having their Instagrams taken down, but ultimately it comes down to this whole idea again that what are men doing to make the world a safer place for women, should those women decide to monetize their sexual interactions with them?
Thank you so much, Adira, for such an interesting and nuanced speech. I'll now move across the floor and to close our first round of paper speeches for the night to Hannah Simayoki. Hannah is a second-year undergraduate student reading English at Pembroke College. She won the right to speak through open audition. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Before I start, I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity to take part in the debate. When I turned up to the dinner before this, a couple of people were like, "Oh, I recognize you. You've done a floor speech." And it's a really cool promotion to go from the occasional floor speech to an actual speech, so thank you. So when I first arrived in Cambridge, as I imagine everyone else here, one of the first things that we had to do in Freshers Week was a workshop on consent. And given that you meet people and then about 5 minutes later you're talking about some of the dodgiest situations you've probably ever encountered, it was a bit awkward. There was always the one guy who said the really questionable thing that made you want to avoid him for the rest of Freshers Week. And you got to find out what people's political leanings were very quickly. But overall, we somehow managed to come to the same consensus. And that was that unless everyone involved in any situation is participating enthusiastically and of their own free will, without coercion and without incentive, then there is proper consent. But in any other scenario, there was not. But this wasn't really the first time anyone had realized this, because the idea of consent has been drummed into us throughout our secondary sex education, as it should be. We come across it on social media, in the classrooms, and in any place where there is rational speech about sex in the modern day. But, emphasis on the word modern here, the idea of consent hasn't come out of nowhere, it's not ubiquitous, and it's not historical either. And therefore, it's not something we should be taking for granted. Because in fact, it is largely the result of feminism, and feminism particularly in the past century or so. There are many strains of feminism, as I'm sure we've all noticed tonight. Some people are Marxist feminists, some people consider themselves intersectional feminists. But the one thing that I think all feminists have in common is their belief in 3 key principles: equality of status to men and between different kinds of women from different backgrounds and social classes, equality of opportunity with all the aforementioned people, and finally, freedom of choice. I'm going to give you a trivial example. Pembroke, the college I'm at, only opened its doors to women in the 80s, and the first female fellow was only welcome in 1994. But given that we are now in the 21st century, I, as a woman, had the opportunity and the freedom to choose to apply to Pembroke, even though I'm not a landowning gentleman. And when I was being considered, I was held in equal status to everyone else who applied. And now I have equal opportunity with all the other students of the college to do basically whatever I like within the rules. And of course, these nominal principles of equality between everyone, they may seem simple on the surface, but they are deeply complicated by economic factors, socioeconomic factors, factors of race, class, and generally advantages and disadvantages in people's backgrounds. I mean, we all know what the statistics of, for example, private school students versus state school students at an institution like this are like. Not everyone, clearly, has had the same opportunity to benefit from feminism, even just within the UK, before you even start taking other less advantaged areas of the world into account. But in some ways, feminism has been good for all women, and here I'd like to return to the idea of consent. Although the first time the age of consent was set was in 1885 at 16, as it remains today, the modern concept of consent is far newer. For hundreds of years, marriage was the only socially acceptable setting for a sexual relationship, and it was essentially a kind of contract, and the contract transferred ownership of a woman from one man to another, from father to husband. And this is no longer the case here in this country, but it's only within the past century, as someone mentioned earlier, that women have had the right to their own mortgage, own bank account, and even more pertinent to this argument is the fact that non-consensual sex within marriage was only criminalized in 1992. Before, it was simply the husband's conjugal rights, but now we call it marital rape, and it is illegal. So if feminists and the feminist movement have fought so hard for the freedom of women not to be treated as complete individuals and not objects to be obtained, used, and exchanged, why do we then make allowances for obtaining, using, and exchanging women in the case of sex work? Some of you may have come across the phrase sex work is work on social media and in speech. And it's not untrue, sex work is a form of work, but so are many other forms of work. I mean, homework is work, corporate work is work, anything that has the name work in it is work. So it doesn't necessarily validate sex work as a form of employment, as a means of making money. And again, we come back to the idea of consent. What can you consent to? What kinds of work is consensual? To take a very grave and completely untrivial example, manual labor in forced detention camps is a form of work, but that makes it neither permissible nor justifiable, and I'm sure that's something that everyone here agrees on. And therefore, also, the idea that sex work, or to use the much more loaded and difficult term, prostitution, is a kind of work, does not immediately make it a neutral ground for discussion. Because the validity of sex work in regards to feminism doesn't hinge on whether or not it's a valid kind of work, but on whether or not it's something that women can legitimately consent to. And I do say women because over 90%, close to 95% of sex workers in the UK are female, and that statistic is higher in other countries. Because consent, as a concept, encompasses freedom of choice, equality of status, and equality of opportunity. All of these are factors in what makes something genuine consent. And we have to ask ourselves, do women from both advantaged and disadvantaged backgrounds have the same opportunities to give consent? Are they given equal status to men and to each other? And can anyone simply freely choose or give consent to an act of prostitution? And the unfortunate answer is no. This does not mean that in all cases it is not possible, but we also cannot say that in all cases it is. I mean, let's start with the really obvious group, because an estimated 3% of sex workers in the UK are victims of trafficking or sexual exploitation. And in this case, I believe the term sex worker doesn't even apply. In this case, we can use the term slaves. They are victims of modern slavery. And globally, there are an estimated 5 million victims of sex trafficking, 99% of whom are estimated to be female, and 20% of whom, even more shockingly, are underage. Obviously, we can all agree that these women cannot consent because they are being coerced or forced into sex work. And yeah, I'm sure that no one opposes this idea. Go ahead.
Sorry, I think it's really important that we don't victimise all sex workers blanketly, because there are a lot of sex workers who choose to participate in that work. They feel really empowered by it, and they make more money doing it than a lot of the men who are paying them. So
Yeah.
I think that's really empowering. I don't think that they're victims, and I think it is a small group of sex workers who are victims.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. That's why I highlight the percentage, 3%, that's very, very far from a majority. Some women really do get to choose, as you say, whether or not to participate in sex work. And the reason they can make this choice freely is because they have legitimate other options. They are choosing between doing sex work or not doing sex work and still being absolutely fine, facing no consequences in their lives. These people may feel that the work they engage in is empowering, and we cannot say, no, you're not allowed to feel empowered by this because you can't dictate what a woman personally feels. But in between these two obvious groups is a much, much larger group of people who may not have been forced into it, but they nonetheless are out of options. They may be victims of poverty, desperation, or simply don't have any other choice. They may have to choose between sex work and homelessness, or sex work not being able to feed their children, and many other situations. I mean, we've all heard the jokes about stripping your way through college. Okay.
What would the difference be between a woman who chooses sex work as a way to make ends meet, and a man who chooses manual labour, or a woman that chooses manual labour to make ends meet? We don't live in a world where in birth you can be given everything and not basic decisions.
I have a few more minutes.
Basic decisions they want to work in his life. I don't see why sex work being manual labour is hard. You may not want to do it, but you're still forced to go, yes?
Excuse me, I'm going to address both these points later. Thank you. And most of the points I've been making so far have been focused on the UK alone, where sex work is pretty well regulated. Women generally are in a much better situation than in lots of other places in the world. But if we move our focus away from somewhere like this, such as locations which are used as sex tourism, such as, for example, Thailand, where a lower GDP per capita means many more women are coerced by their circumstances into sex work, we cannot say that they have equality of opportunity or freedom of choice, and therefore they cannot freely consent to what they're doing. And to make matters worse, they then are the ones who are stigmatized, not the circumstances by which they're forced, not the predominantly men who are doing these things to them, forcing them into this situation, but they are then also made to bear the brunt of the stigma that sex work still faces globally. Violence is enacted upon them, and then they still somehow are culpable for it. See, we have three very different situations here, but uniting all of these groups is the act of sex work itself. And when I talk about this, I mean physical sex work, encounters between people. Women do not simply have equality of status with men when they are engaged in sex work between a woman and a man, because they are not viewed as people in the same way as their customers are. And the sad fact is that the majority of the voices that we hear on the subject of physical prostitution are of the cream of the crop, the women who actually have chosen to do this, the kind of white women in America who Snapchat would make a 5-minute documentary about, rather than the people who are really most victimized by this, who maybe the intersectional feminists here will be particularly concerned with, because factors such as race, class, and economic background so strongly intersect with gender to create different kinds of advantage and disadvantage. What could be more intersectional than acknowledging the prevalence of non-white and working class women in the sex trade? And to conclude, at the end of the day, consent cannot be bought and consent cannot be coerced, because then it is no longer consent. You can't do it in ordinary situations. You can't threaten women or threaten to leak their nude pictures. You can't promise them things. And this fact does not change when it is commercialized, because there is nothing feminist about being subjected to the risk of violence, disease, accidental pregnancy, things that cannot be regulated away. The lack of real, genuine consent, which feminism has fought so very hard to win for every single person in this room, makes it impossible for women who are engaged in sex work to be truly empowered by feminism, because we are autonomous, valuable individuals rather than objects to be bought and sold by and for men. The system of sex work perpetuates abuses even when situations are not in themselves abusive, because where there's demand, there's supply, and supply does not simply come from ethical places. And at the heart of everything, it's the myth of consent that perpetuates the system. Women everywhere deserve better than this, because they deserve true freedom. And to put it straight, women cannot be bought. And therefore, I urge you to vote for the opposition tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for your speech. I move now to our final round of floor speeches. A reminder that paper speakers can respond to these, their right to reply, so it's worth raising questions you have with their speeches. Order. Thank you. We'll move first to proposition. So your hand first.
Okay, I think one interesting conversation that I haven't seen yet that I would like to kind of shove into this debate is this conversation about incrementalism. And I think that it is probably true that ethical, ideal, pure consent is probably not a reality in in every single case when we're talking about like sex works and feminism under capitalism and our current conditions. And what does consent mean under oppression? Elementally, that's going to be different than what it would be under perfect liberalism. But I also think that there are conversations to be had about what to do in the interim and what that looks like in reality. Because I think that in a world where we do not have access to total equality yet, and in a world, frankly, where that is still 50 to 150 years away, depending on the metric you are looking at, the idea of sex work as possibly a problematic element in some regards that is moving in an interesting direction towards liberation is powerful. Specifically, and I think this is something that we largely understand or are in favor of in many different elements of life. I think that obviously in US politics, there's an idea that sometimes you need a Joe Biden to get to a Bernie Sanders. And I also think that sometimes there is this conversation about like representation in media. Sometimes you need a stereotypical gay couple to actually get people to believe that something more liberal with better representation in the future is possible. And I think in a world of webcams and everything else, I think we're moving in an interesting direction where both women have an opportunity for the first time in recent history to not have to engage with men directly and to engage in risk-limiting behaviors and more different types of sex work, that can be an inherently liberating thing, while also it is true that like a lot of women like end up doing something like porn and then carry that stigma for the rest of their lives in ways that end up hurting them. But I think that this idea that it is important that we take this step as this is one way that some women are liberating themselves now, and that there is interesting work within sex work that has the ability to shape feminism in the future is worth fighting for and worth defending, even if shaping this in the future isn't necessarily a done battle. I think like fighting for incremental representation that might be problematic now. Absolutely. I think that there's possibly like a skewed version of sex work that's happening here. Well, I don't think I have to win the idea that like all sex work needs to be feminist, but I think I could win the argument that recent sex work is becoming much more feminist. And in the same way that recent sex work has the ability to become much more feminist in the future, I think, sure. Sorry, can you speak up? Okay, I also think that that conversation is one that has to do with the adoption of technology over time. I think that it is true that any new progress in society is going to hit people who are the most privileged in society first. Things like the internet can be a privilege. However, over time, these things proliferate and become increasingly more accessible to people at the bottom of that society as well. And so I think that while this idea of sex work being compatible with feminism isn't always true, sorry, I have to conclude, isn't always true, I think that there's a lot of elements of it that are, and it's becoming more progressive and more compatible with time in a way that ought to be heavily considered in this debate.
Thank you so much. And then across to abstention.
First of all, English is not my mother tongue, so please forgive my accent and my mistakes. I'm going to read to reduce the mistakes. So I have a question for this house that we sometimes forget when we debate about sex work and feminist or not feminism in theory. And I really feel it must be put at the center and highlighted again and again, as has been done already during this debate. Why most sex workers are women and most clients are men in the framework of heterosexual sex? We cannot ignore this. This derives from a notion of women's bodies as a commodity that can be accessed under payment, and of sex as a right, as access to clean water, which is not, because it involves human interaction, desire, and consent on both parts. And these, the notion of women's bodies as a commodity that can access under payment, and of sex as a right, are notions men in a patriarchal system are raised with. If that mutual desire is lacking, then you have the right to buy a performance, a service, but you're basically paying a person to fake desire, usually to fake pleasure, in exchange for money. I mean, there's a person who's obliterating their own desire because they need to earn. How can this be right? And to say that because we are in a capitalist system, we are always selling our bodies, is a syllogism to me. The fact that working as a sex worker can pay more than another shitty job within the capitalistic system is true. That it allows economic autonomy for many women is true also. Reasoning in economic terms of supply and demand, so since there is demand, then why should we question supply? It doesn't mean anything. The problem is the demand. How many of you here would pay for sex and say it out loud? And how many women would engage in sex work if they had another choice, equally remunerative? Remunerative, how do you say that? Remunerative. I finished.
Thank you so much. And then looking for, did you have?
I wanted to make a point about language, because I've noticed that we're using a lot of the phrase women selling their bodies, but rather it's women selling access to their bodies, because we're not selling like the actual vagina and just like cutting it out. That's all.
Thank you. And then across to the opposition.
It's my first time debating in English since I was 15. So, so I'm Hayoung from Peterhouse. I really enjoyed your speech, but I have a rejection about that. So you said that saying no or we want something from you, since we did sex for you, is a way to strengthen us and to empower women, but I quite disagree with it, because who actually benefits from sex work? If we think about it, it is actually capitalism that makes a hub of all the sex workers who are trafficked, and it's the nature of capitalism that makes the vicious cycle where all the females, even if they want it, and even if they step into it, since they want it, they cannot get out of it. Back in South Korea, where I came from, there was a massive situation where the those who are underage were persuaded that they can earn money in a really easy way. And they were, ever since, became slavery. Like, it is really common thing. And tonight, I was really glad to learn that there are some initiative like Queen or what Chidera works in. But how far and how fundamental can it actually change the conception of sex work? How far can it reach? It actually has limitation. And in that aspect, I do not think that feminism is sex work is compatible with feminism. It can be a new sort of movement, yes, and it can benefit us. But fundamentally, it might not make such big difference in Asia, in somewhere, Thailand, somewhere like that, where women's rights are much less than in privileged area. Yeah.
I think what makes this conversation so fascinating but equally difficult is that there are such murky conflations between sex work and sex trafficking. And I personally believe that sex trafficking shouldn't be merged with sex work, where there are women who choose to monetize access to their bodies off of their own free will, given that they have the comfort to decide that they can leave that particular line of work. Yes.
I agree with what you're saying, but then I was also struck by someone was saying earlier about Pornhub, like many percent of the women who work there have experienced abuse. And obviously Pornhub is an established kind of place for sex work and for like sex media. So how would you separate them if such an integral part of the largest sex streaming platforms is based on abuse and based on exploitation?
Thank you for your point. I would say that a large portion of this conversation still needs to be redirected to male behaviors towards women, because even outside of sex work, especially when we discuss consent as a really important and consistent theme in this conversation, within relationships that are consensual between a man and a woman, there are still situations where men proceed with sexual behaviors of women without consent, even in loving relationships. And so it's still a problem we have with men, how they view women's bodies and how they view consent, because there are men who unfortunately enact violence on women just off of the knowledge that that woman is a sex worker who is utilizing her own autonomy to charge men for access to her body. But in the same way, we need to talk about male violence and male entitlement to women's bodies, because even outside of sex work, we're still running into issues with consent.
Quick thing to that, which is like, again, I think I don't think either of us would say that all sex work is compatible with feminism. That's not the argument we're trying to make. We're trying to make the argument that sex work can be compatible with feminism. So we don't object, or I don't object to any of the inhumane, disempowering, dehumanizing things people are saying. Yeah, please.
What's to the man who's purchasing sex from a woman, what's the difference between a woman who is selling sex because she's feeling empowered to do so, and the woman who is being forced, or the woman who has no other choice? To the man who is like purchasing, obviously not like through your internet situation, but on the like street, what is the difference to that man? Like how can
I would say the difference is the circumstance the woman is in. And oftentimes the man knows what circumstance that woman is in, and that informs the way that he proceeds with that woman. So if that man is purchasing sex from a woman who is successful in her sex work and is successful enough to have the comfort to say no to him and raise her fee as high as she wants to, that man will definitely approach that woman very differently to if he was approaching a desperate, young, possibly homeless woman in the street, because within patriarchy, men will always leverage the ability to take advantage of a woman if they know they can get away with it, even within the brackets of sex work.
Sorry, can I respond to that?
I'm about to move to right to reply, but I want to do one more round of floor speeches. So it might be worth having this discussion within that. But just to come back to floor speeches, anyone wants to make a proposition of the motion?
Good evening. My name is Valentina. I'm at Pembroke. I think at the end of the day, it's really semantics, and it has to do with that there is a big difference between the sex workers choosing to engage in sex work and those forced to. But I think there are forms of prostitution, of sex work, that are compatible with feminism in the current confines of our society. Because the argument is really not whether or not the patriarchy is able to be busted through sex work. It's whether or not women can establish and work for equality of choice, status, and opportunity, as was presented, within the system. There's also been an interesting theme of women of color and women in difficult situations. Venezuelan migrants are fleeing to Colombia in the millions. They're fleeing a socialist system, and they're using sex work as a way to better their unimaginable circumstances. Sex work is being used as a tool to fight against socialism in this example. Sure. But they're using their autonomy to choose.
The idea that empowering and that it's inherent, sex work fundamentally is patriarchal. It has always, until we move out of a patriarchy, will be, because that's the fundamentals of it. You can say that it's empowering to an individual, but ultimately you're still perpetuating and working for the system.
You are not able. You are not able to say what is and is not empowering for another individual.
Order! It is up to the speaker to accept points.
I think I'll continue for now. Thank you.
No, it's up to her to accept the point.
Great. Maybe I'll get to it in a minute. I think I'd like to continue.
It's up to her if she'd like to accept the point.
I'm going to continue. Thank you. The blanket statement that women are not able to choose what is and is not empowering is in and of itself removing the autonomy that modern women have. There are examples of anti-feminist sex work, but there are examples of sex work that is compatible with feminism, and that is the only burden of proof that is relevant in this argument. The debate and the center of this debate is, are there forms of sex work that are compatible with feminism? And the answer is yes. Thank you.
For our final floor speech of the night, I'm looking for a point in opposition.
I think it's
Order.
important. Thank you. I think it's important to make the distinction between when somebody says it's autonomy when it's a woman's right to choose if it's empowering. Do you genuinely believe a woman has autonomy if it's her children starving or her sucking someone off for a fiver? So I think if people want to argue that it's choice, it is not a choice for your children to go to bed hungry, to go to school in dirty clothes, to even be able to go to school at all, or you sell your body. That is not a choice. You cannot say it is a rational choice to make because anybody in the situation would choose selling their body over their children and family starving. So I just think that's an important distinction that has to be made if we're saying a woman has autonomy if she thinks it's empowering. That's wonderful. If you sell pictures of your feet for 30 quid in your bedroom, that's incredible for you. I respect you. You do that. But do not tell me it is empowering and it is a choice for a woman where I live on the street corner to be fucked up against some alleyway and attacked, because she has to feed her children. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid I'm going to have to close the floor speeches now, but thank you to everyone that made a floor speech tonight. I want to say how impressed I was by the thoughtfulness and nuance of all the floor speeches. It's been one of the best I've ever been to, so thank you. I'm now going to move to the right to reply section. As I said, this is a trial. If you think it was a disaster, come find me in the bar after and shout at me. But I think it's worth a go because it's really interesting. So with that being said, Caroline, would you like to reply?
Okay, so I thought that was so interesting, and I really loved hearing all the thoughts from everyone. A few things that I think. One is that like a lot of the conversation I felt was sort of around the debate rather than in the actual what we're trying to debate, which is there a form of sex work that is feminist, right? Is there one? Is there one, right? That's the question of the debate. And so I think we got a little murky where we're like naming all the ways sex work can be not feminist, and I agree with that. That's definitely a thing I agree with, which is why I laid out, all the forms of really unethical practices, right, within sex work. So now I want to talk about Quinn, but more specifically the idea of erotic storytelling or erotic imagination, right? So 70% of women have not watched porn in the past year. Now, that's not to say that they haven't seen porn, it's just, the regular consumption of it. The majority of women use their imaginations when they masturbate. So it's not far off to think that a lot of the sex work we currently are surrounded by, whether it's OnlyFans or Pornhub or whatever, could actually be replaced by a form of erotic performance or erotic storytelling, which I also consider sex work. And I don't think anyone here would say, oh, you can't choose to be an actor, right? You can't choose to be a voice actor. This is what I'm talking about. You're pretending you're storytelling, and this is an ethical, clearly feminist to me form of sex work. And so I think that's kind of just the bottom line, is like we only need to find one, and we did. Thank goodness we did.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Ellie, would you like to exercise your right to reply?
Yeah, I just want to echo what's been said already by the proposition. This has been an incredible debate. And again, we're all so grateful to have been a part of it. This has been an incredible conversation. The one distinction that I want to make that I didn't draw out in my speech, and I don't feel has been highlighted explicitly, is it feels as though this is almost a debate of individuals versus structures when it comes to this conversation. And we're seeing a lot of examples of individuals saying, oh, this is empowering for me. This isn't empowering for this person that I know. And that's great. And I'm so happy for you. And I'm very glad that individuals do have that, have the ability to make those choices that are empowering for them. But I think what's crucially important here is the ability to make those choices carries a lot of privilege with it, a lot of economic privilege, a lot of social privilege, a lot of cultural privilege as well. When it comes to these conversations, taking it from an intersectional lens, disproportionately, it's ethnic minorities, LGBTQ plus individuals and individuals from working class backgrounds that do not have the autonomy, the ability to consent, to make the decision to undertake actions that might be empowering for them. And that's the conversation, and that's the distinction, and that's why I'm on this side. I agree. Sex work, yes. Where? Yes.
But it seems like, but if you're saying there are forms of sex work that can be feminist, by saying, oh, well, there are forms of sex work that are feminist, but you have to be privileged to do them. Even if you have to be privileged to do them, you're still sort of agreeing with the proposition. So what is it? I want the opposition to specifically say what it is about the form of sex work that the proposition are saying is feminist. What is it about that is bad?
If you give me 2 minutes, I will get to that. As I was saying, it feels as though the proposition is exploring this idea of the individual, this idea of individual choices for empowerment. What the opposition is representing is the structure, which is the structure of patriarchy. And we're trying to reflect the reality, at least that I believe, that every single decision undertaken, when it's undertaken under this oppressive system, that is not aimed specifically at liberation, cannot be characterized as a liberation movement, if that answers your question. And just to briefly conclude, I can feel David staring at me. Oh, sorry, yes, please. Oh, no, of course, yeah, of course.
I just wanted to say that I feel like a lot of sex workers feel like they're actually using their sex work to dismantle the patriarchy. They're using it as their form of liberation.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important to distinguish. It's a way that a lot of women don't have the opportunity to get a leg up in a world that they wouldn't otherwise be able to because of sex patriarchy.
Yeah. Right. Do you mind if there's another question? Can I answer them both at the same time? Yeah.
When you talk to sex workers, street sex workers, their fear is mostly the police instead of just their clients. And this happens even in a place like Sweden and with the abolitionist movement, where they feel less safe because of
Yeah. No. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, 100%, yeah. I think it's sort of directly responding to that really quickly. I will be quick, I'm sorry. Directly responding to that really quickly, I have never once stated in my speech, nor will I ever say that I want to criminalise sex work. I have stated from the beginning, individuals that choose, that consent to go into sex work, that is valid, and that is not something I want to criminalise, stigmatise, because I feel like it has been raised in the floor speech, that pushes individuals away from conversations about sex work. It pushes individuals further to the fringe of these conversations. That's absolutely not what I want to do. And responding to the other point of information, what was it again? I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh.
Basically, that there are sex workers who are using their work to
Yes.
dismantle
Yes. So, yeah, I think that again comes back to this distinction that I was making between the individual and the structure. I think individuals, to an extent, individuals engaging in certain actions that feel empowering is incredibly valid and is incredibly important, but I think it does not do enough. It does not contribute to the eradication of the overarching structure that we see in our society. And for me, personally, the aim of feminism is the dismantling of this oppressive structure and the liberation from it. And so actions undertaken that do not specifically relate to the dismantling of that system, do not relate to structural action, for me, cannot be categorized as feminism. So I feel like David's going to shout at me if I keep talking. But just to very briefly summarize, like I said, this debate was not intended in any way, shape or form to stigmatize sex work, to villainize individuals that engage in sex work. That is not, if you go away with anything today, please do not go away with the idea that sex workers should be villainized at all. It is a valid form of expression, of medium, as been raised by the proposition. It's just this side of the debate, we are arguing does not contribute to eradicating the overarching and oppressive structure of patriarchy, and that is why we oppose its relation to feminism.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Jadira, would you like to exercise your right to reply?
Thank you everyone for being here today and taking part in this really important and pivotal debate. I want to just contribute a point being that as the recession rises, so will sex work. We're going to, probably everyone in this room might know someone who is a sex worker, you just don't know that they're a sex worker. And I want to encourage everyone in this room to try and look out for each other. We're seeing, as sex work rises, we will be witnessing a lot more of people being deplatformed or people being ostracized or even being doxxed. And I just want to also remind people that, you know, some of us in this room might remember being younger and having a mum that did everything that she could on her own to make things happen. And there were some Christmases where presents just turned up under the tree. And I just want to make it clear that sometimes the reason why those presents turned up under the tree is because your mom might have had to do sex work in order to keep you alive and to bring gifts your way. And so I just want to encourage people to understand that we need to humanize sex workers as much as we can and to not get lost in the machinations of the debate, and remember that behind all this there are people who are either making choices because it will enhance their lives or making choices because they have to. Thank you, everyone, and I'm really grateful.
And finally, to close the debate, Hannah, would you like to reply?
Everyone said it already, but again, thank you. Thank you for this evening. It's been wonderful. I don't have much to say. I just want to respond to a couple of things that have been raised and make my final point. I wanted to respond to something you were saying about being able to tell the difference between women who've chosen this and women who've had to choose this. It's easier to make that distinction in a country like the UK where sex work is not criminalised, where it's quite well regulated compared to a lot of countries, and generally in other Western countries like the USA, Sweden, we've all got examples. But in countries where sex work is still criminalised, it's badly regulated, where there's corrupt police, corrupt pimps, there's a far less regulated system, it's much more difficult to differentiate between women who have chosen and women who've had to choose, which is not the same. And I think we need to be careful that when we're talking about this in a general way, we're not focusing too specifically on a country where things are statistically better than for women in many other places in the world. And to add to that, I also want to differentiate another thing, which is that making decisions which benefit you in the context of a system that oppresses your gender does not necessarily dismantle that system, it simply helps you to survive it. I'm sorry, I don't want to take a point of information because people are already leaving. So while you might feel that you're empowered, which again, you're entitled to feel, while you may feel that your actions in your individual life are dismantling the system as it affects you, that does not necessarily mean that you making the best of that system is helping to bring it down altogether. You've simply managed to make the best of it in a way that others haven't. And just to conclude all of that, the exception doesn't make the rule. And the proposition, while managing to still make very valid points, have said that the motion is about, is it possible to prove that even one kind of sex work is compatible with feminism? But I don't think that's what the motion is. The motion is, this House believes that sex work is compatible with feminism. As with all motions here, it's generalizing. We're talking about sex work as a massive body of things and of people which are all wildly different. There's millions and millions of different types of sex workers around the world, and as well, victims of trafficking, which we're differentiating. So yes, perhaps it is possible for certain types of sex work to be feminist and empowering, but that does not mean that we can wholeheartedly say that sex work is compatible with feminism, because, as I said, the exception does not prove the rule. And I want you to think of all the countless women whose voices we haven't been able to hear or talk about tonight because they are oppressed by the system which holds them hostage. And I want you to think about that as you walk out of those doors. Thank you.
Thank you so much once again to everyone that spoke tonight. This has been a really quite profound and special debate. Some very quick notices before we leave. If you'd like to go to our winter ball, it's the 28th of November. If you'd like to run a ball, applications for Lent Ball President open now. Finally, in this house, we vote with our feet. If you are swayed by the motion, please go out the right doors through the eye. If you aren't, go out the nose, and abstentions walk through the middle. If you're up the front, you'll be given a card and a table to vote. But thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.